War affects medicine in many ways. It spreads disease, it causes casualties, it stops research and takes doctors and nurses away from civilians. It also leads to new medical inventions and ways of working. This programme looks at surviving records from the First World War, fought between 1914 and 1918, which resulted in 24 million casualties, both soldiers and civilians. Did the war help or hinder medicine?
We work for hours and hours without rest, moving from stretcher to stretcher. The overcrowding beggars belief. Between the stretchers, the walking wounded slump, waiting patiently for their wounds to be dressed or for a shot of anti-tetanus. Sometimes, a man on a stretcher vomits explosively, spewing over himself and his neighbors. Sometimes, they die in their stretchers, and we're so busy we don't discover them for hours.
In the First World War, doctors and nurses were needed as never before. For many men and women, the war was an opportunity to practice as doctors, nurses and ambulance drivers in the very worst conditions. Captain Lawrence Gameson was a medical officer in the Army Medical Corps. He wrote a diary recording his experiences.
We work by candlelight. The air is bad. There is blood everywhere. There is little water. No running water, of course. Dressings and filth pile up. We can do so little. We just bandage them up, hand out cups of tea, and give them painkillers if they're screaming. There are so many wounded. We hardly scrape the surface.
It was sometimes said the huge number of casualties from battles led to improvements in medicine, especially in surgery. This is what the official history, written at the request of the British government, said about it.
The number of battle casualties during the war gave the surgeons a great opportunity for surgical work. And as the years went on, the improvements in method and the skill acquired in dealing with wounds placed war surgery in a position which it had never occupied in the past.
But Gameson's diary gives us a different view of how successful surgery was at the front.
Sit down, man. You look terrible.
I'm fine.
Frontline medical officers like Gameson weren't there to carry out operations. Their job was to patch up casualties by bandaging as best they could before sending them back to surgical hospitals, some of which were 20 miles behind the lines, well away from the fighting. But in many cases, surgery would come too late.
You look like you need it. Just had Corporal Peters through. Do you know Peters? He's a regular rocks. You just lay there asking, would he play again?
Play?
Football. He's good. Surprisingly nimble for such a large man. Well, was. I cut away the dead flesh, but there's nothing to stop the gangrene. So, we'll just send him back down the line, by which time it'll be too late and the leg will have to go. They could have saved it. Not now. What was it? Bullet. Went in the back of the thigh, smashed the bone at the front. There's a hole 3 inches thick. Maggots swarming already. Couldn't even give the poor sop a shot of tetanus without hurting him more. The needles are so blunt. I mean, do you not think they've suffered enough without us skewering them with blunt needles?
Get some sleep.
Yes.
There's another push at 0600. 4 hours. All right. I'll wake you.
Before the war, surgeons had been practicing conservative surgery. Instead of removing limbs, they carefully cut away at damaged bone and allowed the limb to heal, so at least the patient didn't lose an arm or a leg. But with such huge numbers of casualties, the dirt, and at first the lack of antiseptics at the front, wounds quickly became septic. And amputations increased dramatically. Many of the official photographs that survive stress the excellence of the medical facilities, but the private written sources offer another view.
Nobody can ever imagine the fearful wounds these men have. It is not like one sees on the lovely ambulance train arriving in Southampton with slightly wounded men. If I told you some things that come in here, you would be horrified. And it's just as well that England has not seen yet these remains of what were bright young men, brought in to die in a few dreadful hours.
The War Office felt the horrors of war had to be kept from the British public. There was a great need to keep up morale at home, to make people feel that the war was going well. There was a highly organised system for dealing with casualties. This plan from 1915 shows how casualties either walked or were carried to field dressing stations. They were then sent by horse, ambulance or foot to casualty clearing stations, where doctors decided whether they needed to be sent to hospital or not. This system only broke down when the number of casualties became too great. As part of the system, medical cards were introduced in the First World War. This helped doctors to keep track of a patient's medical history. It was a useful development which carried over into civilian life. Before this, doctors didn't automatically pass on information about how patients had been treated. Now, any doctor who came along could find out what the patient's medical history was without asking the patient for it. It's often said that war leads to new inventions and treatments. Blood banks were developed as a response to war. As war weapons grew more deadly, more soldiers received serious injuries. The pressure of casualties meant that army doctors needed vast amounts of blood to cope with the terrible injuries on the battlefield. Before the war, a blood transfusion was only possible if the donor, the person giving blood, was on the spot. The need to be able to store blood led to the introduction of sodium citrate, which meant that blood could be stored and used without the donor being there. The war also made the search for new antiseptics more important.
We had never seen wounds become infected as they did in this soil. They quickly developed gangrene, which meant that the skin became grey and bubbled up. It was made worse as the bullets often carried fragments of dirty cloth into the wounds.
The doctors were not expecting this problem. The Boer War, 15 years earlier, had been fought on dry, sandy soil in Africa. But the wet, muddy soil in France meant that the wounds became infected very, very quickly. Carol Dakin's solution was a powerful new antiseptic. which helped to clean out the wounds and stop infection spreading. It helped to save many lives and limbs. X-rays were not an innovation of the war. They were invented in 1895, but they were widely used at the front to find bullets and examine injuries. So many more people were trained to use X-rays because of the fighting.